nature of philosophy is also to define philosophy not as pure theory, but as a movement, as a real movement. A movement to create, to establish new possibilities in thinking. And so that sort of scheme is only the inscription of the movement. So if philosophy is only on the side of zero, or on the side of the void, it's in fact a nihilistic position which is experience, pure experience of the void of existence, or the inexistence of any positive, affirmative, and constructive knowledge. But if philosophy is only on the side of the one of omega as a symbol for infinite, in fact, finally, philosophy is either positivism or positivist theology on the side of a metaphysic of God. So the philosophy is the movement itself, from the nihilist position to the affirmative position, and is not reducible to the two positions. And it is why in Hegelian tradition, after all, but it was the position of Heraclitus at the very beginning of all that, philosophy is movement. It's a movement of thinking. And it is also why we have a beginning and a goal. Beginning, experience of negativity, and goal, transformation of subjectivity. Corruption of young people as a real goal. But naturally, this movement is with a different stage, different steps. It's not a pure gesture, just a passage. And so we have also, in the dialectical conception of philosophy, the question of the different moments of the construction of the new affirmation. And so there is something like a constructive part of philosophy. Not only pure movement, not only the beginning and the goal, but different steps. And when we are speaking of different steps, like that, it is like a decomposition of the movement. And so we have also to understand what is the fundamental steps in that sort of decomposition of the movement of philosophy. And it is this part which is of systematic nature. why exists, why philosophy exists in the form of some philosophical systems. It's precisely because we cannot reduce the movement of philosophy at a pure intuition, at a pure instinct, at a pure revelation. Philosophy is not mysticism. We can name mysticism the idea that the movement from inside the nihilism to infinite affirmation is the same experience. The same experience is an experience which goes across nihilism and in the same experience, in the same movement to the infinite itself. And we have description of that sort of experience in Saint Jean de la Croix, or the great mystic, and in a part of Oriental wisdom too. It's not something which does not exist, something which exists. But it's near philosophy in some sense, because it is the same movement, but it's the same movement as a pure experience, outside language, outside, in fact, transmission, rational transmission. It's a pure experience of the infinite inside the nothingness. You know that in the great mystic people describes precisely a form of disparition of themselves, a sort of nothingness of the pure existence, and in that sort of destruction of themselves, a pure access to the glory of the infinite, generally to something the name of which is God, Omega as God. Now, so mysticism is something like that. We are nothing in front of the infinite, but we have a pure access to infinite in the complete realization of our nothingness. If we accept our complete finitude and nothingness, if you accept to be nothing in regard to the infinite, you open an immediate access to the infinite itself, and this infinite can be in relationship with us, in a close and intimate relationship with us. And that sort of experience is described, in fact, as a love experience. It's not at all a linguistic or rational experience. It's a pure experience where we, from the pure acceptation of our nothingness, we open love access to the infinite, and in return, we experiment the love of God for us as the price of all that. And it's a very beautiful, magnificent experience. I don't know the experience as such, but I can read. And after that, the expression of that sort of experience is of poetical nature, always. Great poems of great mysticism are magnificent pieces of literature. And we understand perfectly why. If the experience is love experience and not at all experience which is inscribed in rational movement, the natural inscription of this experience is not a treatise, a system, a construction, and so on. The form of inscription of that sort of experience is naturally a poem, a pure writing, a creation, in fact, creation of the life. So if we are in the world of mysticism, we are also in something like the world of relationship between love and art. Return to all these problems. It's not, there is absolutely no relationship to science or politics. There is an enclosure of the relationship, the intimate relationship between love and art. Love in the experience itself, the experience really of the love of infinite for the finite, the love of God for creation and so on, by the acceptation of the creature to be only creature, and complete and radical acceptation of that sort of nothingness in front of God. But we have, after that, we have an intense experience of the love of God for creature as such. It's very beautiful, but we understand that it's also a closure. There's a difference with philosophy. It's not a critique to say that. It's a representation, a personal representation of the experience of a sort of negativity which is enclosed finally in the potential of the infinite. The potential of God. If God is the name of infinite, there is a different name after all. The name of that sort of experience is not by necessity God, and it's an experience we can find in many cultures, in very different cultures, and in very different religious contexts. So it's an experience by itself. And you know, it's an other possibility to go beyond nihilism. Other possibility in philosophy. We cannot add something like that. We take the two terms. We know that if this point is isolated, we have nihilism. If this point is isolated in the form of a separate knowledge, we have two possibilities in positivism. Or theology. But theology in a rational form, as a knowledge, rational theology, separate, which organize the possibility of a rational representation of God and so on. And we have a sort of unified movement, which is mysticism, and a movement, organized movement, which is philosophy. Very difficult. So we are now in front of four possibilities, finally, because mysticism is absolutely not reducible to nihilism. Mysticism is a very specific experience of nothingness, which is immediately and in the same intimate movement transformed in a relationship to the infinite. But it is not the rational construction step by step of philosophy. So it's exactly the contrary of a system. Mysticism affirms that the the religious question, the question of to go beyond nihilism is not at all a question of construction, rational construction. It's a question of possibility to find an issue, to find an opening inside the pure experience itself. So it's a nihilism which is inside itself transformed in something absolute. It's the absolute by the movement of the experience of nothingness. And so it's another possibility, but it's an absolutely closed possibility. The mystic finally is alone. It's always a problem. The mystic is a form of radical solitude with God. But God is a strange companion. Yes, it is a strange companion. It is exactly what are saying the mystics themselves. They very often said that they cannot describe the experience. Generally, they say that there exist some poems and so on, but it's pure approximation. It's not true. It's not the true experience. The true experience is indecible. We cannot describe the experience, and this is why it's a pure solitude. There is no transmission. You can eventually prepare some person to that sort of experience, but finally all that is nothing at all. The true experience as such happens as a singular revelation, and which is cannot be described by any means. And it's the position where we have to choose, to do the choice to be with God and not with the world as it is. And finally not with people. And it is why the mystic is alone, and the effect of mysticism is a sort of pure effect of attraction. There is a description of that by Bergson in my traduction in English of Les deux sources de la morale et de la religion. Les deux sources de la morale et de la religion.
So two springs of morality and religion. Voilà. Two sources.
It was a fundamental book of Bergson. And in this book, there is a description of the position of mysticism, and Bergson explains that the position of mysticism is not a position which can be transmitted, which can be described, and so on, but we have an action on other people by a pure attraction, a pure example which is very difficult to understand, but we exert a sort of attraction, like finally the sun for the movement of the sea, the moon for the movement of the sea, and it's really an elevation in the direction, in the obscure direction of mysticism. But it's not. Finally, it's purely individual, that. It's purely individual destiny and the singularity of an encounter between one people and God. So it's absolute, it's an event, a personal event, and a chance, maybe a grace, to have that sort of experience. And it is very difficult to say something concerning mysticism, because there is really a part of all that which is completely obscure in the closure of pure subjectivity. The closure of pure subjectivity. And but it's the same movement as philosophy. Very important to So mysticism is something like philosophy immediately. Philosophy without patience, without work, without labor. Philosophy, but philosophy reduced to its pure movement. But if we return to philosophy, we must understand that philosophy precisely is not mysticism. The relationship between philosophy and mysticism is not the same that the relationship between philosophy and nihilism and philosophy and positivism. Philosophy is not against the mysticism. There is no, it's not a part of philosophy to, it's not a part to critique mysticism, to destroy mysticism. No, it's the same movement. If mysticism exists, okay. How can we say something against mysticism? You understand? If exists that sort of experience, we can only say maybe that sort of experience does not exist. It's an illusion, something like that. But it's not very strong, very important. Is there an experience of the same movement purely at a level purely individual, purely as a personal event? There is some people who describe, without really describing, that sort of experience in some great text, poems, and so on. And we cannot say more than that in the philosophical construction. So there is two enemies of philosophy, nihilism and positivism. We cannot say exactly that mysticism is an enemy of philosophy, because mysticism says in some sense the same thing. First, the experience of nothingness is a necessity. And second, we can go beyond nothingness. These 2 points, which are of fundamental importance for philosophy, are also the points of mysticism. But there is something in philosophy which is more on the side of patience, construction, conceptualization, labor, and so on. The movement is not a pure and immediate movement. There are steps, there are passages, and so on. And it's strange to imagine a society where everybody will be a mystic. Everybody completely captured by God. It's a dissolution, naturally, of all collectivity, all positive collectivity. It's a strange image. It's an image of science fiction, after all. A society where a pure juxtaposition of individuality which are immediately in relationship with God. Maybe it's the situation of angels, if angels exist. In the description of angels in medieval philosophy was something like that. An angel is in so close relationship to God than all what is not God does not exist in some sense. So an angel is also in relationship to negativity. An angel is without any world in a concrete sense. In fact, the more complete angels, because in the tradition of Aristotle there is a classification of angels. There is poor angels and very aristocratic angels. seraphim, cherubim, and so on. But in the case of the purest angel, we have something like a constant mysticism, a constant relationship immediate with the infinite, a constant experimentation of the love of God for the angel, and a complete disparition of all what is not really that sort of experience. So a first society of completely reduced to mysticism would be certainly a society of angels. And the only difference between philosophy and mysticism is to say that we are not angels. Maybe some of us are angels, why not? Hidden angels, angels disguised into human beings. But it's very important for philosophy to affirm that we cannot affirm that we are angels. And so we cannot say that mysticism is finally our obligatory destiny. So it's not a negation, it's not a critique, it's much more a doubt concerning the angelic nature of human beings. So we must affirm that the construction of the philosophical movement is, in some sense, always systematic. And systematic, we must understand systematic as non-mystic. Systematic is not, very often systematic is something like a depreciation of philosophy. Oh, systems. But it's absolutely. Systematic is not the image of a machine. Systematic says that we have a construction. Certainly understand. We have the definition of some steps to have finally a description of the movement. And not something which cannot be described, like in mysticism. So systematic is the name for non-mystic. It's a true negative definition of systematic. After that, we have different forms of systems. Many steps, no many steps, and so on. Infinity of possibilities in the construction, naturally. And every philosopher proposes a description, a particular description of the passage from the experience of nothingness to the experience of something affirmative and maybe infinite. But systematic is only the consciousness of the existence of different steps in the movement. It's not an immediate revelation. We have to learn, we have to go, we have to understand, and we have to be in a sort of patience. And we have to accept also that there is some moments of repetition, as always. When we have steps. The most clear example is precisely the example of numbers. Numbers also are a movement from 0 to the infinite. After 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So the construction of numbers is also in the form of repetition, which is going to the infinite. As you know, the succession of numbers is infinite. There is no the last number. So we are really in sort of image of what is the passage from nothingness. Zero is the name, is a numerical name of nothingness, in fact, and something which, beyond all numbers, is the first infinite. But the process of the passage from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on, is repetition. It's a repetition because it's the same process. It's a process which is to place from n to n plus 1. N to n plus 1. And every step is a repetition of the movement of the step before. So, is the philosophical passage of the same nature, finally, that the numerical succession? This sort of scheme is naturally not a philosophical one. It's an arithmetical one. So it's an image for us. For the philosopher, it's only an image. An image of a sort of passage from zero in direction to the infinite with different steps. It's an arithmetical image, nothing else. But this image is interesting because on 2 points. First, the passage contains a repetition. Not a repetition of the object, but the repetition of the passage from an object to another object. You know that, for example, 3 is not the same number than 2. So it's not properly the repetition of object. It's not 1, 1, 1, and 1, and so on. Really, we construct something new, in some sense. Because the number 3 is not the number 2. So every number is something like a new number. So the process is not repetition in the sense of repetition of the construction itself. No, we construct really, successively, different numbers. So philosophically, if you want, we have really a process of production of differences, and not the process of pure repetition of the same object. But the passage of one object to another object is the same. It's one. It's the same. The passage from 2 to 3 is 2 plus 1, but it's the same as the passage of 1, and so on. So, and it is why this image is important. We have in the image, the vision, it's the first point, no? That it's possible to have creation of something new inside and by the means of repetition. In some sense, the passage from 2 to 3 is a pure repetition of the passage from 1 to 2, and so on. It's the same operation, exactly. And the result is not the same, because 3 is not at all true and is not equal to 1, and so on. So we produce something new by the same operation. So it's a dialectics, once more, between difference and sameness, or between difference and identity. we have a difference, production of difference, infinitely different numbers, by the means of a repetition. So by the means of something which is not at all different, but absolutely identical. So it's absolutely the most clear image of dialectics between identity and difference, which find its more achieved philosophical determination, the philosophy of Hegel. The philosophy of Hegel is entirely the extraordinary construction of something new with the dialectic of identity and difference. So it's a number which is purely arithmetical, in some sense, are dialectical. You know, the most clear object of mathematics is not purely analytical. It's also dialectical. It's a dialectics of identity and difference, really, in act, and in a very clear form. It's the first point. So the first point, very important. If philosophy must go beyond nihilism, not in the mystic form, but in the form of a real process, it will be certainly by that sort of process, not exactly a numerical process, not at all, but by a process which is a mixture, a dialectical mixture of identity and difference. And you know the place today of the question of identities and differences in the ideological fight. It's a question, a fundamental question. Politics of identities, respect of differences, Derridean concept of difference, and so on. So all that, all the components of dialectic thinking are really of great importance today. It's not at all an old and dogmatic question. But we find that in the succession of numbers in some sense. It's also something completely simple and clear, and it's also something completely complex and difficult, and finally of political nature too. Because if something is political today, it's really the problem of relationship between identity and difference. Certainly. In the question of sexual gender, the question of difference of culture, the question of minorities, and so on. All that is many forms of the question which is abstractly present in the succession of number. It is how we can produce differences and accept differences when the process is, in some sense, the process of identity. And you know perfectly in the relationship to the other, the question is simultaneously my difference with the other and the identity of the other. So, what is the most important thing? My difference or the identity? And it's a constant difficulties of political nature. The most important point is to affirm absolutely my identity, or the most point, very important point, is to respect and accept the difference. And if the most important point is identity, it's not the same consequences if the most important point is difference. It's not exactly like here. You can say all numbers are absolutely different. 3 is completely different from 2. But you can say also, yes, but 3 comes from 2 exactly like 2 comes from 1. So in the identity of the process and the difference of the result, we have really a dialectical contradiction. The second point is that this term does not result of the repetition. Because omega as such is not the result of something like that. When we take a number as big as you want, this number with 1 is another number. It's never something infinite. So, we can say that all the process goes in the direction of omega, but we cannot say that the process produces omega. The infinite is not produced by the process, because the process, which is this process, passage from a number to the number after, this process cannot go to the infinite as such. Because the number after a number is a number, and is a finite number, not a finite number and not an infinite number. So the second point is that we can say that the process is a process from 0 to the infinite, but the infinite as such is not a result of the process. So here, if you want, there is a cut. There is something like an interruption of the process. So the process is oriented by the infinite, but the infinite is not produced by the process. Okay? So the totality of the process from 0 to omega is made not only of the passage, which is also the same, which is the same passage from a number to the succession, not only of the passage, which is always the same, so not only of repetition, but also of something like an interruption of the repetition at the end. At the end. But the end of the repetition is on the side of infinity. The repetition as such has no end, because with a number we can always produce the number after. You understand? So if we are to think that the philosophical process is really the passage of pure negativity to absolute affirmation, like with as an image the succession of numbers, we must affirm that there is not only one operation, but two completely different operations. First, a repetitive operation. So there is always something like a repetitive operation. And we can give immediately many examples in the Hegelian dialectic, in the Kantian critique, in the metaphysics of Descartes or of Hellenism. You can very simply and directly identify some operations which are constantly repeated by the philosophers. The passage from one notion to another notion, to create new concepts. The operation of repetition is of a very important nature. But there is a first operation, which is a repetition, which is always of the same form. For example, in Descartes, the deductive passage of one sentence to another sentence with a mathematical model. call the dialectical passage by negativity from one assertion to another assertion. But there is another operation, which is the operation of a cut or an interruption of repetition. We must assume also that second form of operation, which is a rupture inside the repetition. That is an interruption of the repetition. And the image of that is clearly the position of the first infinite number, which is omega, in regard to all the numbers, the finite numbers. In some sense, the repetition goes in the direction, absolutely in the direction of its last term, which is the first infinite number. But in another sense, there is no possibility to go to this term by the strict action of the repetitive operation. So, if you affirm the existence of omega, you create a cut in the repetition. Because the repetitive action cannot go to omega itself. We can say that omega is beyond the repetition. Mathematically, it is said that omega is the limit point of the repetition. And so, in philosophy too, where the question is also to go from experience of negativity to absolute affirmation, if we are not in the mystic context, where there is something immediate in the connection, one operation, we have also to consider two different operations. It's a fundamental aspect of philosophy. There is always a moment in philosophy where we cannot accept to only continue the fundamental operation. There is a salt, there is a cut, there is an interruption. In Plato, which is Plato who is the first, in the first we find always all the future and so on. In Plato it's very clear. Plato, the fundamental operation in Plato is, as you know, dialectical discussion. The discussion with argument proposes some successive definitions of something. For example, we have a discussion about the question of the very essence of courage, and you discuss with the general, with some people, and step by step, always by successive refutations of the other oppositions, we go to the definition of the question, the definition of the courage. So, dialectical discussion is the fundamental operation of the philosophy of Plato after Socrates. But finally, we cannot go in the form of discussion. And Plato creates something completely different, which is a myth, a poetical myth, a story. The story of Air at the hand of Republic, the story, a pure image. And that sort of image is exactly at the position of the cut. The dialectical discussion is the successive production of many possibilities of definitions, new concepts, and so on. But at the end, when you are on the question of the absolute, we cannot go with the same operation. And this is why Plato proposes something like an image. A characteristical, absolutely characteristic text is when Plato proposes the conception of the idea of the good at the end of the thinking. And he explicitly says that he cannot propose a pure concept, a pure definition of this idea, but only an image. And it's the image of the sun. He says that the idea is in regard to all the concepts in the same position that the sun in regard to the light of the world. But why an image? Why we cannot continue? Precisely because we have by necessity an operation which is in the form of a cut and of an interruption and not of continuation of the dialectical discussion. And it is why the presence of some myths in Plato is not at all a singularity, is not at all something strange. It's only the second operation. The second operation after the rational creation of concept by means of rational discussion. And it's always like that. There is always, it's another manner to read great philosophers, to find the two operations, to identify the two different operations in the philosophical context. The moment where the fundamental operation of a philosopher cannot be useful and must be replaced by something else, like the myth in Plato after long sequence of rational discussions. And we find the two operations in absolutely every philosopher. Maybe sometimes the 3 or 4 operations if the context is complex. But identifying clearly two completely different operations is something which is of great interest. And it is why my most important concept, I speak of myself for the moment, are precisely on the same form. Because, as you know, my question is to find something which is a dialectical result of universality and particularity. Something like the singularity in Hegel. Okay. But by what sort of operations? What sort of operations when I say that the truth is the name for that sort of exception, immanent exception, which is simultaneously of particular nature and addressed to everybody, with possibility of resurrection, okay, in another world. But when I say that, how can I identify the construction of a truth, the different steps of a truth? Certainly, I must propose a name for creative repetition, like a passage from 1 to 2, and then creative repetition because there is a repetition of the passage, but creative because the numbers are new. But it's really, strictly speaking, a creative repetition. I do the same thing, but the result is different. Donc I must propose something like that, but I must propose also the question, something which describes the cut, the second operation. And my name, I propose then for the cut, for the second operation, the concept of event. An event is precisely in the position of what interrupts a repetition. And for the first operation, my name is Fidelity. Fidelity is the name for the creative repetition. And my position is only that, and it's the difference with arithmetic and image of mathematical nature. My position is that before 0, there is a cut too. It's a question of the beginning, and the beginning is not the result of a repetition, but, as I say, the beginning is an experience, the pure experience of negativity, of that sort of experience happens. It's not a result of a repetition. It's a cut in our life. When at a certain moment you have the experience, true experience of anxiety, of nothingness, of nihilism, is something which is not a repetition of our proper nature, something which happens, and which is not, which very often is not so pleasant. It's an experience, a difficult experience. So it's an event. It's something which is also an interruption in our life. And so the process of the construction of a truth begins by an event. And so we have something like that. The process is a process from an event to truth. This is why it's not the same. This is why it's not the same. Well, il faudrait a panoramic screen. It's not, and you know, it's not exactly the image. Something different. You see, if in fact we have something like omega under the name of the truth, and we have something like 0, but something like 0 is the element of an event. So the interruption is also at the beginning. Now, we have to do that, but finally, we have to understand that in philosophy, the conception of the relationship between truth and event, which is the idea that there is always a beginning of the construction of a truth, which is not in the nature of the repetition, but of the interruption of the repetition. This relationship is also the relationship between two different operations in the field of philosophy. A repetition as a creative process, which is, in my jargon, fidelity to an event, and interruption of that sort of repetition by an event as such. And to finish, I just propose a succession of concepts. I cannot do anything. you after the end of the lesson, you go to see the picture. We have the succession of concepts, which is like a recapitulation. First, we have being and existence, the dialectical contradiction between being and existence, and this part is ontology. In some sense, an event is always a rupture inside the question of relationship between being and existence. An event opens a new possibility, exactly as a cut creates the possibility of infinite beyond numbers. In the same sense, and more generally, an event is always something which creates a rupture in a certain form of relationship between being and existence and create a new possibility. Fidelity is the organization of the consequences of the event. So, fidelity is precisely something like a creative repetition. It's absolutely the definition, the true definition of fidelity in the field of law, in fact. It's not only I don't have a sexual relationship with something else. No. It's clearly that the construction of law as such is the continuation of something. Really, I continue, but if I continue without something like a creative manner of continuation, it's impossible to continue. Continue cannot be strictly repetition. Everybody knows that. So all the problem of law is not to repeat. All the problem of law is to invent something new inside the process of law itself. And so it's exactly the same thing. We have an event which is the equivalent of the encounter in law of relationship. You encounter somebody after all. It's the beginning of law. But after that, we have to construct something. And we dispose, we create something which is in some sense a repetition, because I continue with the same person, but in another sense which is a creative, which is a creation, something new. So it's a position of fidelity. This, inside fidelity and to oriented fidelity, we have by necessity a new subject, which depends on what is the event, what is the initial situation of relationship between existence and being, what is the operation of fidelity, and so on. And all that created truth. True love, true science, true work of art, and so on. And you have something which is particularly appropriate to all these notions. For example, to think what is exactly an event, we have always art. It's not philosophy we describe. Philosophy creates a concept of what is an event and formal characteristic and so on. If you want to describe a particular event, it's always art, which is the strongest possibility. In fact, mysticism is complete reduction to all the scheme to the only event. And this is why it's always poems which describe mystic experience, pure event. Fidelity, we find something like that in logic. Logic is an abstract theory of creative repetition. It is why my image was arithmetic. But more generally, logic is the theory of consequences. as a theory of consequences is finally an abstract representation of theory of fidelity, of the same operation which repeat and create something new. Now, subject, in fact, it's the field, the classical field of psychology, but also psychology is, we speak of the individual subject, and politics, if we speak of collective subject. And truth, the theoretical equivalent of truth is epistemology. As a description of the condition of the truth, what is the truth, what is the scientific truth, and so on. So, it's my conclusion. It's true that the process of the truth is composed of a certain form of ontology. That is, the beginning is always what exists, the world as it is, in its being and in its existence. It's true that we have, after that, by necessity, to open a new possibility, a rupture in the repetition, so an event. It's true that to construct something on the basis of this event, we have to be in a sort of creative repetition, which is fidelity to the novelty of the event. And once more, love is probably the more simple example. It's true that all that construct a new subject, a new individual subject, a new collective subject, different. For example, love constructs a new subject, which is the couple, which is not 1 + 1, which is the two. And the two are the new subject, a subject which does not exist before, the encounter, the fidelity, and so on. And truth is something which is said, which is affirmative in the construction of event fidelity subject, and which is a possibility for everybody. And in fact, we perfectly know that a great love can also be understood in another world. We perfectly understand the love in the great poems of antiquity. We know perfectly the love between Troilus and Cressida, Héloïse and Arbella, etc. So, truth is something which can be understood from a complete other world, and is true also for love. Like for mathematics, a great work of art, and so on. And all that is true. So it's true that all that is what must explain philosophy. Philosophy is always an affirmation that something like that exists, and that something like that can be understood by rational beings. And at the second line, is the aesthetic. At the second line, we have so philosophy. Philosophy is the general thinking of the process of truth as the process of the two operations, event and creative repetition. And the steps are existent being, event, fidelity, subject. But it's false that we must study all the steps, step by step. So this disposition which separates ontology from aesthetic, from logic, from psychology or politics, and from epistemology. This organization in separate forms is only the discourse of university. And philosophy is not at all the addition of separate movements. Philosophy is not a piece of ontology, a fragment of aesthetics, some moments of logic, a bit of psychology, and finally something in epistemology. All that is the study of philosophy in university, but it's not philosophy. Philosophy is the understanding of the complete mind. And so naturally, in a great philosophy, we can find ontology, aesthetic, logic, politics. But this philosophy is not at all the addition of all that sort of pieces. Philosophy is the transmission of the movement, the integral movement of the construction of the truth. And so there is no different parts. There is the construction of the process in a sense which authorizes the construction of the possibility of its transmission. And this point is important. I don't say something against this disposition. Maybe it can be interesting to have some notion concerning the different parts. But it's not philosophy properly. And it is why we cannot see great philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Heidegger, Deleuze, we cannot cut them in two pieces. We know that there exists something like the philosophy of Deleuze, that it's not ontology and aesthetic and so on. It's the philosophy of Deleuze. And it is also a style, it's also a writing, it's also a feeling. And finally, is something which goes from an existential experience to the creation of concepts without being a decomposition of the process in two pieces. Okay, so philosophy is finally one thing. There is a unity of the philosophical construction, and it's exactly like a work of art. A work of art is not the collection of different disciplines. The work of art is a creation of something new. It is the same thing for philosophy, which is much more, finally, something like a work of art than something like an academic learning. Thank you.